Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Deanna Fenton, Program Manager here at the Alliance, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Living Donor Liver and Kidney Transplantations, Pushing the Envelope by Changing the Paradigm. Now, before we begin today's presentation, there are a few housekeeping items that we'd like to share with you all. For optimal visual and audio experience, we do recommend accessing these webinars in the Chrome browser. If at any point you encounter any issues, please log back in using Chrome. If you're already using Chrome or continue to experience any issues, please dial in using the phone number that was provided in your confirmation email. Now, to those of you who are new to this webinar platform, please take note of the chat feature that's located in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. This chat should be used to pose your questions to our speakers. If you have any questions that come up during the course of the webinar, please feel free to submit them at any time. Once the presentation has concluded, we'll have some time for our presenters to address as many of your questions as time allows. As a quick note regarding our upcoming webinars, registration is currently open for our next webinar, End of Life Conversations, a Collaborative Approach to Donation. That's coming your way on October 8th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Registration is also open for our upcoming Innovation webinar on technology tools to improve organ acceptance. Be sure to join us for that on October 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern. For more information on these webinars or to register, please visit our website at organdonationalliance.org. Now, for anyone who's interested in obtaining continuing education credits, we are offering 1 CEPC credit and 1 nursing contact hour for this webinar. Please note we do also offer a certificate of attendance, so for anyone seeking CEs that are not available, we do recommend submitting a certificate of attendance to your credentialing organization as proof of your participation in this educational offering. Everyone joining us today is entitled to claim either of these credits or certificates. Prior to receiving your certificate, you will be asked to complete a brief online evaluation that will allow you the opportunity to provide us with your valuable feedback. If you're listening in a group, as many of you are, please be sure to get the evaluation email from your group lead. As a friendly reminder, you'll have 14 days to complete your nursing evaluation and claim your credit, and you'll have 30 calendar days to claim your CEPC credit. Now, at this point in time, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Belinda Jones, our very own program consultant here at the Alliance, and a valued member of the Transplant webinar faculty. Belinda, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today, and at this point I'll go ahead and turn it over to you to introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Deanna. It's my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's webinar, Dr. Humar and Dr. Mona Doshi. Dr. Humar is a renowned transplant surgeon, and as Chief of Transplantation at UPMC, he oversees all clinical and clinical research activities at one of the world's most active and prestigious transplant programs. Dr. Humar's areas of research include partial liver transplants, including live donor liver transplants and studies of hepatic regeneration, tolerance protocols, clinical outcome studies in kidney, liver, and pancreas transplants, and outcomes in pediatric kidney transplants. Dr. Humar has had more than 600 abstracts accepted at national and international transplant meetings. In addition, he has authored or co-authored more than 180 manuscripts, 25 book chapters, and 3 books. Dr. Mona Doshi is a renowned transplant nephrologist. As clinical director of the Live Kidney Donor Transplant Program at the University of Michigan, she oversees all clinical and research activities at one of the world's most active and prestigious transplant programs. Dr. Doshi's research interests include medical outcomes in African American living kidney donors and ischemic reperfusion injury after deceased donor kidney transplantation. Dr. Doshi is participating in the multi-center national study Apollo, which is going to study the outcomes for African American living kidney donors. So I would like to turn it over to Dr. Humar.
Hi, this is Susan Piccarelli. I'm in Dr. Humar's office. He's on his way here from the operating room.
All right, why don't we go ahead and start off with Dr. Doshi's presentation today. So Dr. Doshi, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you.
No worries. So good afternoon all, and I would first like to thank Alliance for the invitation and give me a chance to talk to all of you and take questions later. And thank you, Belinda, for the very kind words. So let me just orient myself and get started. So what's the agenda for today? We're going to review the advantages of living donor kidney transplantation over dialysis and deceased donor kidney transplant, review the risk and complications associated with living donation, and lastly, talk about expanding the pool of living kidney donors. So let's start with the introduction, and I would like to start with some background. So let's focus ourselves on this left-hand slide right here. The graph on the left-hand side shows the number of patients waitlisted for kidney transplant in this green line. What we see here is from 1998 to 2010, the number of people waiting for a kidney transplant has increased steeply. The magenta line right down here shows the number of patients who've actually received a kidney transplant, both from living and deceased, which also has increased from 1988 to 2010, however, has not been able to match with the growing demands. As a result, there's a widening gap between demand and supply of kidneys for transplantation. So what are the consequences for our patients while they're waiting on the wait list? So if we focus now on the right-hand side of the slide, it shows, as a result, on an average, 13 people die each day while waiting for a kidney transplant. And in 2014, around 5,000 patients died while waiting for a kidney transplant. Another 4,000 people became too sick to receive a kidney transplant. So this is an immense growing problem, and we need to find solutions for that. But before we jump straight into transplant, let's see how does dialysis fare compared to kidney transplantation in terms of patient survival. So this graph here shows the patient survival on dialysis after a deceased donor kidney transplant and after a live donor kidney transplant. We look at survival at 1 year in yellow line. Orange line bar here shows 2-year outcomes. Blue shows 5-year outcome, and magenta shows 10-year outcome. What we see is at any given time point, patients on dialysis do fare much poorly than those getting a kidney transplant. If you look at the patients receiving a kidney transplant, those receiving a kidney from a living donor transplant do far better. They live much longer than patients getting a kidney from a deceased donor transplant. Therefore, dialysis should be considered a bridge to transplant for anybody suitable to get healthy enough to get a kidney transplant. So moving along, so far we looked at outcomes in terms of patient survival. Let's look at graft survival between patients receiving a kidney from a living donor in the red line and those receiving a kidney from a deceased donor in blue line. What we see is the patients receiving a kidney from living donors, those kidneys seem to be lasting much longer than those who received kidneys from deceased donors. At 5 years, if we pay attention here, at 5 years, 91% of kidneys obtained from living donor transplant are functioning as compared to 86% received from a deceased donor after deceased donor transplantation. Moving to the next slide. So what are some of the advantages of living donor kidney transplant? As it's very obvious, there are several advantages for the recipients. They have shorter wait time, so they can get a kidney right away rather than waiting for a kidney from a deceased donor. The kidneys come from a living person, so they tend to be much healthier. Generally, kidneys come from one of the related donors, so the recipient can get by with less immune suppression. And as mentioned before, they have better patient and graft survival. On the other hand, the advantages for the donor is personal satisfaction of helping a loved one. So therefore, currently, the live kidney donation is acceptable on the premise that it carries minimal short and long-term risk to the donors. So in the next few slides, what I want to do is review what are the current outcomes in living in donors after nephrectomy. We'll be focusing on perioperative complications, risk of kidney disease, including future need for dialysis, and lastly, risk of hypertension also. So let's start off with the perioperative complications. So the perioperative complications were studied recently by Dr. Sagev from Hopkins, who evaluated the early mortality and length of stay and other perioperative complications in donors. And thankfully, what the authors reported in 90-day mortality, after live donor nephrectomy remained low at 3.1 per 10,000 donor and has not changed over the last 15 years. I think this is pretty remarkable, as we all have seen that the age of the donor has been on a rise. Also, the number of comorbidities, including we are using kidneys from more obese donors. So I think this is good news. Despite the growing comorbidities among the living donors, the mortality remains low. And the surgical risk was higher in men versus women, among African Americans versus white, among Hispanics versus non-Hispanics, and among hypertensive donors. The same group now also looked at the length of stay. So here in the light gray line, what we see is the rates of complications from 1998 to 2010, and the overall trend of rates of complication is on a decline. If we also were to look at the length of stay, which was around 3.5 to 4 days in donors in 1998, is now almost down to 2 days in the current era. On the right-hand side, the graph here shows the complication rates after living donor nephrectomy in the light gray bar, and to common surgeries such as gallbladder removal or appendix removal. And what we see is the complication rates after living donor nephrectomy is pretty similar to that of common surgeries. And the length of stay also after living donor nephrectomy is pretty similar to other common surgeries. So overall, the mortality after live kidney donation has not changed, and neither has, and in fact, we've made remarkable improvements in complications and length of stay after the surgery. Let's now focus at long-term consequences, medical complications after live kidney donation. So this was first evaluated by Dr. Ibrahim and colleagues, who looked at survival of around 3,500 former kidney donors and compared that to general population. What this group found is that the survival of kidney donors is pretty similar to control, almost up to 40 years of follow-up. These investigators followed the donors at least for around median follow-up of around 15 years. So what is remarkable is the donors with a single kidney do as well as non-donors with two kidneys. Looking at other outcomes such as hypertension, so let's look at this table, which compares the blood pressure, renal function, other comorbidities in live kidney donors to that of controls from general population. What the investigators reported is that the blood pressure, both the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure, was similar between kidney donors and those individuals from general population who did not donate. The percentage of donors requiring blood pressure medications at median follow-up of 12 years was 25% versus 30% among people who did not donate, and therefore this difference was not any significantly different between the two groups. So in other words, live kidney donation does not increase risk of hypertension. Also, the authors noted that vast majority of the kidney donors, around 85% of kidney donors, had kidney function greater than 60 ml per minute at median follow-up of 12 years. I want to pause here and let's look at the patient characteristics of the donors. What this group studied was predominantly white donors. 99.2% of the cohort consisted of white donors. So what we can draw from this study is that all the white donors seem to have very good outcomes and have incidence of hypertension at a similar rate to that of general population. So let's move on and see what happens to donors that belong to other race groups. Now this was studied very cleverly by Dr. Lentin et al., who looked at prevalence of hypertension and chronic kidney disease across donor groups across all races using physician claim data and pharmacy claim data. So she looked at 4,600 former kidney donors from 1987 to 2007 from OPTN and linked it to private insurance to gather billing data. What she reported, so here what we have is outcomes in terms of hypertension. The donors are represented in the middle and the general population on the extreme right-hand side. After adjusting for age and gender, what she reported is that the non-Hispanic white donors are 50% more likely to develop hypertension using the medical claims database, and 30% at a greater risk for developing hypertension using the drugs pharmacy claim database, which is similar to what is generally seen in general population. Looking at prevalence of chronic kidney disease, the theme continues. Again, the African Americans are twice more likely to have chronic kidney disease, stage 3 or higher, than white donors. Moving along, we also said I would be talking about rates of end-stage kidney disease. Dr. Sagev and his group compared the rates of end-stage kidney disease in donors, that is, donors requiring dialysis or transplant, and compared that to unscreened non-donor population from general population. And what we see is, thankfully, the live kidney donors have a lower rate of requiring dialysis or transplant as compared to unscreened non-donors. That means these people from general population were not screened for good health at baseline and did not undergo routine testing and extensive testing that our living donors go through. However, if we were to compare the rates of end-stage kidney disease among living donors and healthy non-donors, now these healthy individuals were screened for good health just like living donors at baseline. And what we see is the risk of ESRD is higher in living donors than healthy non-donors, perhaps due to familial and genetic factors shared between the living donors and their related recipients. However, the absolute risk of ESRD was far lower than general population. So I would like to summarize as follows. So if we were to look at immediate complications among donors, perioperative mortality remains low. Rates of early complication due to donor nephrectomy are on decline, and length of stay is also on a decline. Looking at long-term complications, long-term survival of the donor is pretty similar to that in non-donors. Rates of hypertension and chronic kidney disease are low in Caucasian donors and are higher in African American donors, but the absolute rate of ESRD remains low than that seen in general population. So now that we have reviewed the complications after live kidney donation, let's see what are the strategies for promoting live kidney donation. So the traditional approach for a living donor evaluation used to consist of the following steps. The first, the donor needed to be healthy. Then the donor had to be ABO compatible or compatible with regards to blood type with the recipient, and also had to be cross-match negative with the recipient. Now, how have we overcome each of these barriers? We are nowadays pushing the definition of healthy. So in recent years, we have increased the number of older donors, that is, number of living donors from age 50 to 65 years of age have been on a rise, and almost 30% of our current living donors belong to this age group. We are more willing to accept donors with BMI greater than 30 or obese donors, and we also are willing to accept kidneys from living donors with hypertension only in selected population. Generally, it is white donors, potential donors with hypertension, blood pressure well controlled with a single agent are allowed to donate in absence of any other end organ damage. This need to push the definition of healthy stems from changing in the trend of general population. Nowadays, more and more people are living longer, more and more people are getting obese, and more patients are therefore getting high blood pressure. So the donor population reflects what is happening in general population. What is the new approach of living donation after jumping the obstacle or hoop of finding a healthy donor? We now have a new paradigm where we have to lead to the transplant center who takes care of compatibility. So the recipient is just responsible to find a healthy donor, and the kidney transplant center will take care of the rest. So what are some of the strategies that have been used by a transplant center to find a compatible donor? So on the left-hand side, let's look at this case. You have a mother right here who wants to donate to her son. However, they have a cross-match positive, and they are not a compatible pair. On the other hand, you have a husband who wants to donate to his wife too. However, they are incompatible too. However, if you were to swap the donors such that this mother is compatible with the wife and can donate, and her husband who is compatible with the son and can donate directly to the son, so now we can overcome the barrier of incompatibility between two pairs and at the end get two living donor transplants. This can be expanded, and we have a rise in altruistic donors. Altruistic donors are people from general population who just want to help anybody with kidney disease. They do not have a particular recipient in mind. They come forward and want to donate a kidney, and they help out starting this big long chain of donor-recipient pairs, and as a result, the last donor who's left in the chain donates to one first patient on the deceased donor wait list. Now, this kind of swapping of donors has been on a rise, and as you see from 2000 to 2012, several of such transplants have occurred all around the country. And you'll be surprised how long these chains have been. We've had 60 lives were saved via 30 different recipients receiving a kidney transplant, and this chain was reported in New York Times. What else have we done? So let's take a scenario where a grandfather who's 65 years of age today and has a grandchild who is maybe in his 20s and needs a kidney. However, the recipient, the grandchild currently has a decent GFR of around 20 and doesn't need a kidney right away. However, the grandfather is healthy and knows that down the road he may not be healthy enough to donate. So what the new program called Advanced Donation Program allows the grandfather to donate today while he is healthy, and the recipient in return gets a voucher so that when time comes for the recipient or the grandson to need a kidney, he can be on the top of the wait list and get the first kidney available. So this is called Advanced Donation Program. It is not currently available in every single transplant program, but I think this could help expand the number of living donor transplants. What else has occurred in an attempt to increase the number of living donor transplants? Our recipients have been very, very resourceful and have used different strategies to find a suitable donor. This is an example of using a billboard trying to find a living donor. Here this gentleman has asked, I think it's his friend who's asked for a potential donor to save the life of his friend. People have posted on Facebook, and I've seen several donors come along reading posts on the Facebook, and they may not necessarily directly know the recipient or may have been a friend of the recipient several years ago in school. I've also seen patients wearing T-shirts where they write, "I am in need of a kidney," and they write the contact information, and have had donors approach that way, that they've seen someone wearing a T-shirt and have come to the transplant center. And lastly, there's a program called Live Donor Champion, where the transplant center works with one of the family members of the recipient and trains them as to how they can approach the relatives or friends of the recipient, asking them to consider to donate to the recipient. Now, not all these strategies work for all patient populations, so each transplant center needs to critically evaluate the patient population and then utilize appropriate strategies that would work for their patients. So another very important advancement that we've made in the field of living donation is that while the evaluation of kidney donor is paid by the recipient insurance, the travel, lost wages, child care, etc. are not currently covered. President Trump signed an executive order on July 10, 2019 to cover these expenses so that live kidney donation is not financially burdensome on the donor. I think this is a very important advancement, and and it's very helpful to potential living donors. So at the end, I would like to summarize my talk by saying the following. Dialysis should be a bridge to kidney transplant. We should encourage live kidney donor transplant by removing all the disincentives such as lost wages, child care, travel expenses. And lastly, incompatible should not be a barrier to live donor kidney transplant. Let your transplant center figure out and find a compatible donor for your recipient. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi. Now I'd like to turn the presentation over to Dr. Humar.
Hi, thanks a lot. Okay, well, let me just dive right into it and switch gears and talk about live donor liver transplant. Just as an introduction, we know that liver transplant has come a long way in the last 35 years. It now really represents probably the only way to definitively treat end-stage liver disease with very good results, 1-year survival in the 90% plus range. The biggest problem with liver transplant, however, is the fact that there are just not enough liver transplants for all the people that need them. So if you look at the current status of liver transplantation in the U.S., there are roughly about 8,000 transplants done on a yearly basis, but there are about 14,000 people that are waiting for a transplant on the waiting list. And that creates three very important consequences of this waiting list and the gap between the number of people that need a transplant and the number of transplants actually performed. The first and the biggest is that there's about a 15 to 25% chance, depending on what part of the country you live in, that you're never going to get your transplant, that you will succumb from your liver disease before making it to the top of the waiting list. For the people who are lucky enough to get a transplant, what it does mean is a longer waiting time before receiving a transplant. And unfortunately, during that period of time, the patient is getting sicker, and so that by the time they come to a transplant, they're in a more debilitated state and therefore less able to tolerate that transplant, and a more difficult recovery for them afterwards, often in a rehab facility because they are so sick going into the transplant. And finally, the third important consequence is that we can't list all the patients that could potentially benefit from a transplant onto the waiting list, or we don't, because there's certainly no point just adding on to that list. If we're only going to do 8,000 transplants, there's no point putting that list up to 30,000 as opposed to 14,000. And so we limit the number of people that are on the list by just choosing the people who are going to have the best outcomes, not necessarily all the people that could potentially benefit from a transplant. So a live donor liver transplant just represents one option to these three problems. That essentially what it entails is taking the part of a healthy donor's liver. Now, unlike the kidney where you have two kidneys, we obviously only have one liver, but we have a lot of redundancy built into our liver, and so it's possible to remove a significant portion of it and still maintain adequate liver function. The other unique thing about the liver is that it's one of the few organs that we have that will actually regenerate. So those two unique abilities make it possible then to do a live donor liver transplant. And there are a lot of advantages to a live donor liver transplant. Obviously, if you're never going to get a liver and you have a living donor, then right away that eliminates the waiting list mortality. But even for those who could potentially get a cadaver transplant, a deceased donor transplant, the presence of a living donor means that you can get your transplant in a more timely fashion, so decrease the waiting time, transplant these recipients before they become critically ill, and you essentially convert what is often an emergent operation done in the middle of the night to an elective one done in the daytime, which is important because it allows you to optimize the recipient so they're best able to tolerate that transplant. There are other advantages, including the fact that you have minimal cold ischemia, immunologic advantage, some financial benefit to doing living donor transplants, as I'll show later. But one important thing is that you add to the pool of organs. So for every one individual that receives a living donor transplant, that's one individual that doesn't need a deceased donor transplant, and that frees up an organ for someone who doesn't have the option of a living donor transplant. So those are the advantages. They have to be balanced by the disadvantage. The disadvantage of the recipient is that at least initially there's decreased hepatic reserve because you've only got half the liver. There is a higher incidence of bile duct and vascular complications because of the technical nature of the procedure, but those are all manageable. Really, the main risks that we have to consider are the short-term and the long-term risks to the donor. Because remember, this is a unique situation where you're operating on an individual that doesn't need an operation. So, but as you can see, the way I've drawn it here, I feel that the advantages definitely outweigh the disadvantages of this procedure. Yet despite this, live donor liver transplant remains highly underutilized in the United States. So in 2018, there were a total of 401 live donor liver transplants performed, and that accounts for less than 5% of the total number of transplants, and the number has really remained stagnant over the last sort of 15 years. And if you compare this to other places in the world, especially in the Far East, you can see that the USA remains far behind in terms of utilization of this procedure for patients. And there are very few centers that actually offer live donor liver transplants for their patients. There are 160 liver transplant programs in this country, but in 2018 there were only 12 centers that did more than 10 of these procedures in a year basis. And you can see that there are very few centers that have done more than even 100 in their entire history. And so you can see that the number of centers that really have embraced this procedure is not very many. So why is that? Why has live donor liver transplant remained so relatively low in this country? There are lots of reasons. The technical expertise it requires, the commitment to build up a team that can do this. We're highly regulated in the United States. You know, CMS, the state, all highly regulate transplant. When there have been complications in donors, especially donor deaths, they've been highly publicized and can be risks to the program as well as risk to specific team members. But in my mind, the main reason really has been that people don't know about this procedure or are misinformed about this procedure. And by people, I mean the people who need the transplant, the family members who are looking after those people that need the transplant, the providers, the healthcare workers who are looking after those patients, the family physicians, gastroenterologists, hepatologists even at transplant programs that don't do this procedure, they don't really know a whole lot about it. And finally, the payers don't really have a lot of information about this and have misgivings about this procedure. We at our center believe strongly in live donor liver transplant and have invested heavily in developing both live donor liver transplant for our pediatric as well as our adult patients. As you can see from the volumes on a yearly basis, you can see that that we're doing a good volume of these cases, roughly about 70 a year over the last 2 years, and this year we'll probably be somewhere around that mark. Also, the majority being adult patients, but a good number being also pediatric patients. And in our adult population, roughly about 55% of the transplants we're doing this year will be from a living donor, as compared to the national average, which I had told you before, which was about 4.5%. And this is the volume of transplants compared to other centers, and you can see again that we've got the experience behind doing these procedures. So if you're going to push this procedure, you have to have good outcomes to back it. And when we talk about outcomes with this procedure, you have to talk about outcomes in both the donors as well as the recipients. So what are the outcomes like? If you look at donor and the risk to the donor, the national data shows that as of the end of August, there have been 7,117 of these procedures that have been performed. To date, there have been 6 early donor deaths reported related to the operation, and 3 donors that needed a transplant of their own. So if you look at that, roughly about 0.1 to 0.2% estimated risk of mortality associated with this procedure. The overall complication rate in various studies that have been done is roughly around 30%, with major complications accounting for about 10% of those. Our own data over the last 20-some years that we've been doing this procedure here at UPMC, we've had no donor deaths, no cases of liver failure, and our overall complication rate is roughly about 20%. with the major complication rate accounting for about roughly just under 10% of that. Our mean length of stay for donors is 5.8 days. Other measures of outcome, most of our patients are back to work somewhere between 6 to 12 weeks, depending on what type of work they're doing, and most report being 80 to 90% back to normal level of health by 3 months post-donation. What about outcomes in the recipients? We looked at this recently, our experience over the last 10 years, and compared our outcomes in the living donor patients, which is shown in the left column, 263 patients, to outcomes in our deceased donor population, which is roughly about 600 transplants. And this is the demographics, which are relatively similar except for one big difference, which is that the patients who get a deceased donor transplant are sicker. This is the calculated MELD, not the actual MELD. It's the calculated MELD based on the lab scores, and you can see there's a difference of about 22 to 16. And so patients who get a live donor transplants are not as ill, but that really, in my mind, is one of the big advantages of the living donor procedure, is the ability to do the transplant before patients get very sick. These are the survival curves in the patients, in both patient and graft survival. You can see that there's roughly about a 5 to 10% survival advantage over the course of the first few years after transplant, which is statistically significant in the live donor versus the deceased donor patients. Other measures of outcome, length of stay, less in the live donor patients, 11 versus 13 days. Roughly about half of our live donor transplant recipients do not receive blood transfusions intra-op, and the incidence of major complications, including renal failure, is significantly less in these patients. Technical outcomes, so that's, as I mentioned before, one of the concerns with regards to live donor transplant is there a higher incidence of complications, and our feeling is that as you get more experience with it and get more comfortable with it, these results improve. And so again, comparing the two data sets, you can see that there's really not much difference in terms of outcomes with regards to technical complications rate, whether it's regard to arterial thrombosis, portal vein thrombosis. Now, overall bile duct complications, which is one of the main complications of live donor transplants, is roughly the same in our series between the two, though our incidence of early bile leaks is slightly higher in the living donor transplants, but the incidence of late biliary strictures is lower in the live donor transplant patients. And finally, I had mentioned to you before, the financial outcomes tend to be better. This was a data set of all transplants done in 2017 that we did. We looked at the live donors versus deceased donors and compared how often they were coming to emergency room, how often they needed radiology scans, and what their hospitalization was. This is looking at a period from 6 months before their transplant, the transplant itself, and then a year post-transplant follow-up. And you can see that the bottom line shown at the very end is that the total cost is roughly about 30% lower. This is hospital costs, is roughly about 30% lower for the patients that received a live donor transplant versus those that received a deceased donor transplant. This is our outcomes versus the rest of the country. You can see on SRTR, the blue dot represents us. We have a good volume as shown by the x-axis, and the y-axis shows that our outcomes are better than expected. The other benefits that we've seen is that significant improvement in our transplant rate. On the left, that was our transplant rate back in 2015. You can see that it was lower than the expected. Fast forward to last year, and you can see that our transplant rate is now significantly better than our expected, and that's just because we're doing so many more live donor transplants. And again, we're starting to see a slight decrease, at least anyways, in our waitlist mortality in that period of time. In 2016-17, our waitlist mortality was 25.5, whereas now it's down to 24.4 on the last iteration. Does complication pertain to complications for donor or recipients? There's a question from Gavin Sweeney about complications. The complication, I had presented the complications for both the donors as well as the recipient, but the chart that I had shown, and I'll just go back to that very quickly, which is this chart right here. This is looking at complications pertaining to the recipients, not the donors. This is the complications in the recipients that I'm referring to. Okay, so this is how live donor liver transplant has evolved at our center. We started initially, roughly about 10 years ago, as I said, looking at patients that were low on the waiting list but had bad prognostic signs, patients with tumors that were in and out of criteria, international patients, so relatively patients that were lower risk. As we saw that we could get good results on this, we expanded to doing higher MELD score patients using various strategies that have been well described in the Asian literature. Patients that we knew could benefit from a transplant but didn't necessarily qualify, patients with hilar cholangiocarcinomas, metastatic colorectal cancer, HCC beyond Milan, metastatic neuroendocrine tumors, to the point where now where we feel that a suitable living donor really is the first option for all of our patients, regardless of their underlying disease, whether it's an acute liver failure or chronic liver failure, whether it's a malignancy or non-malignancy, whether it's a primary transplant or a retransplant, whether it's a young patient or an older patient, or whether it's a low MELD patient or a high MELD patient. And in fact, in certain situations, we feel that a live donor transplant is actually better than a deceased donor. So for example, this is the high-risk patients, retransplants, higher MELD, HCC patients beyond Milan. You can see that we don't have any difference in terms of our outcome. And in those recipients that are older, 70 years old or more, we really feel that a living donor is the best option. And the main reason for this is that older recipients very poorly tolerate a transplant when they have a MELD score of 30 plus, which is what they need to get a deceased donor transplant. They're much better able to tolerate the transplant when they have a lower MELD score. So what are the keys to success? You have to have a strong team that's fully committed to living donor transplant, consisting not only of the surgical and the medical people, but also nurse coordinators, social workers, financial people, living donor advocates. You have to educate not only your patients and their caregivers, but also physicians and other healthcare workers that are going to talk to their patients when they see them first about living donor, or refer them on to you to get living donors, and to the payers who can help promote this among their clients. And so we send brochures to our referring physicians talking about this. We meet with them on a regular basis. We do sessions like this to essentially spread the message about live donor transplants. We work with our patients with something called the Champions Program that really essentially helps them to find donors by using all of the resources at their fingertips, including social media. So our feeling now is that we think that it's time to change the way we think about liver disease in the setting of a live donor liver transplant program. Remember, all the current rules of allocation, including MELD score, were created for that situation where you have 14,000 people and only 8,000 livers. You have to figure out how to utilize a limited resource. And so those rules are good, but those rules don't necessarily apply in a live donor liver transplant situation, because there the equation is not 14,000 to 8,000, it's 1 to 1, one donor giving to one recipient. And really we feel that the criteria for living donor liver transplant should be based on the ability of the procedure to provide a survival advantage for the patient. So our selection criteria at our center are relatively simple and straightforward when it comes to a living donor transplant. If we think that the patient can have a significant survival benefit with a liver transplant versus best other therapy that's available to them, and they have a suitable willing donor, then we think that's a good indication to proceed with a liver transplant. We think using this as well as various other things, including expanded criteria donors, machine preservation, etc., it is possible in the near future to eliminate the wait list and prevent patients having to wait for transplant. And the key to this is obviously education of all those people that I talked about. So I'll stop there, and unfortunately I don't have to run and don't have time for questions, but if you forward them on, I'd be happy to try to respond to them at a later time. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Humar.
All right, thank you.
I'd just like to thank Dr. Doshi and Dr. Humar for such a great presentation. Before we begin our Q&A session, I'd just like to remind everyone that if you do have any questions for either of our presenters, please submit them using the chat feature. Again, that's going to be located in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Unfortunately, as Dr. Humar mentioned, he will not be available for the Q&A discussion, but if you do have any questions for him, please don't hesitate to submit them, and we'll be sure to follow up with him after the webinar has concluded. Also, during the Q&A session, I'll have this poll up. For those of you who are listening in a group, if you could please just complete this poll and let us know how many people are participating in your group, we'd greatly appreciate that. Thank you so much. At this point, I'll go ahead and turn it back to Valinda to moderate your questions.
Thank you, Deanna. There is a question for Dr. Humar. I don't know if he's left yet, but we can at least record it. If I donate part of my liver today, can I donate again later? Gavin Sweeney says, do you know if the UPMC program accepts altruistic living liver donors or only those with a relationship to the recipient? Another question for Dr. Humar is, how far outside Milan criteria will you transplant, and what is your recurrence rate among the patients transplanted who are outside of Milan? And that was submitted by Jamie Brown.
All right, so Jamie and Janine and Gavin will be sure to, and Tosin, will be sure to follow up with Dr. Humar to get some of your questions addressed, and we'll follow up with you after the conclusion of the webinar.
Janine Morris has an additional question. How many living donor coordinators do you employ? Tosin has an additional question. Can a person be eligible for living donation regardless of their citizenship status? At this point, I don't see any additional questions that look like they're for Dr. Humar. Do we have any questions for Dr. Doshi? So I'm waiting to see. I have a couple of questions. Dr. Doshi, you showed that we're using kidneys from older donors, obese donors, and those with hypertension, and also using new strategies to seek for living donors. Then why have the rates of living donor kidney transplants in the United States not increased?
That's a very good question, Valinda. I think the rates of living donor transplants have increased in the whites, where we are accepting donors with older donors, obese donors, those with hypertension are all limited to white donors only. However, we've seen a decline in non-white donors, more so recently because of concerns about their long-term medical outcomes, especially in young African American donors, due to future risk of developing chronic kidney disease and hypertension after donation. Therefore, we've become more cautious. We have more stricter standards for accepting kidneys from minority racial groups, and therefore, despite pushing the envelope, trying to use kidneys from people that we didn't use before, such as obese donor, older donors, we have not seen an increase in living donation rates.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi. I have another question from Rebecca Weisberg. Do you have a BMI cutoff?
Yes, we do not accept donors with definitely BMI greater than 40, but anybody between 35 and 40, we recommend them to lose weight.
Thank you. We have another question.
Linda, just a minute. This is not mainly for surgical complications, but this is, obesity comes with its own risk of hypertension, diabetes, heart problems, bad cholesterol profile down the road. So we're worried about the medical outcomes in the donors long term. That's the reason we have BMI cutoffs, and the BMI cutoffs are a little more stricter in a young donor and those with strong family history of diabetes.
Thank you, Dr. Doshi. Another question we have is, how prevalent is the Advanced Donation Voucher Program across the United States transplant centers? And are you aware of any transplant centers in California who participate in that program?
The voucher program is just growing. I am not aware of a program in California, but I know Georgetown does it. But it is just out there, and people are just trying to embrace it now.
Additional questions that we have is, not necessarily for you, Dr. Doshi, but just to address them, is do living liver donors require having their own insurance? And do you have a BMI cutoff for living liver donors? Another question from Gavin Sweeney for you, Dr. Doshi, is the Advanced Donation Program also applicable to liver donation? Do you know if that's so?
No, I would not know. No, I don't
know. Tosin, can the last question be answered at this time from the first presenter? Dr. Kumar has already left, and so we will have to get an answer for you later.
My gut feeling says if you had a prior liver donor, I don't think so you can donate later, but this is just me. I would leave it for Dr. Humar.
Hey, Dr. Doshi, what are the recipient outcomes when using a kidney from an older donor?
So the graft outcomes were compared between those getting kidneys from older donor to that with deceased donor to that with younger donor in a recent study. And what it shows is getting kidney from older living donor is similar to getting a kidney from a deceased donor, okay? But it may not be as good as getting a kidney from a young living donor.
We have a comment from Catherine Carmichael saying that UCSF is just beginning the family voucher program. We also have an additional question. This one is also for Dr. Kumar. Also would like to know what factors impacted the large jump in number of living donor transplants between 2015 and 2016. Dr. Doshi, we have another one for you. Do all centers in the United States participate in kidney paired exchange programs?
No, unfortunately not all centers participate in paired exchange program. I would say a vast majority do. So if a transplant center does not have such a program, they should counsel an incompatible donor-recipient pair to go to another center, and that does offer paired kidney exchange program. And in very selected cases where the sensitization is very low, then desensitization may be an option, but given the availability of paired kidney exchange, I think that would be the first strategy to use.
Thank you. Dr. Doshi, I have a question from Kelly Wyatt. What is the percentage of living donors that require a kidney transplant post-donation?
So kidney transplant post-donation, I think it varies by race. So it is as low as let me just tell you, I don't want to. So the rates of ESRD are lower in after kidney donation than general population, which is 3.2% in general population. However, lifetime risk after donation among donors is 0.9, and the risk varies based on race. So 15-year cumulative risk of end-stage kidney disease or requiring dialysis is higher in black donors at 0.75% versus in white donors it's low at 0.23%.
Thank you. Have a note from Lisa Mathias from Henrico Doctors Hospital, Transplant Center in Richmond, Virginia, stating that they participate in the NKR voucher program as well. Another question for you, Dr. Doshi. Does the Advanced Donor Program help decrease the incidence of having bridge donors who may subsequently end up not donating?
No, not really. Bridge donor and advanced donor are two different things. Generally, a bridge donor starts with an altruistic donor who wants to donate. So I think there are two separate ways to increase the number of live donor transplants.
Okay. I don't have any additional questions at this time.
Okay. I think I would just like to make a comment to all the listeners because they may have heard about it. There's a national study called Apollo, which is looking at APOL1 genetic testing in deceased donors and live kidney donors, mainly in African American. The premise is that perhaps this gene called APOL1 is implicated in development of kidney disease in African Americans, and so some transplant centers offer APOL1 genetic testing to their young African American kidney donors so that they can better predict the future risk of kidney disease, and perhaps sometimes they use to counsel the donors, and some centers use that to decline a kidney from a young African American donor. So this is out in the horizon, and I just wanted all the participants to hear about it, as they are likely to hear about it down the road.
Dr. Doshi, we have another question for you from Gavin Sweeney. Is the higher risk of kidney disease in African American donors disproportionate to the risk of kidney disease in the general population?
No. The risk of kidney disease in donors is pretty similar to that seen in general population. In fact, it is lower, so the donors have a lower rate of ESRD than that in unscreened general population. That means they never check their health at baseline, right? Because donors are generally healthy because they go through a lot of screening tests prior to donation, so they're healthy at least one point in their lifetime. So if we compare the rates of ESRD in African American living donors, which are much lower than that in general population, however, is higher than African American non-donors. So I think a lot of this risk comes from shared familial, genetic, socioeconomic factors that are shared between the living donor and the recipient. Does that clarify
one more question
for Janine Morris? Janine, did I get answer your question? Okay, Melinda, we can go with the next one.
Okay, the next question is, often a parent reluctant to accept a kidney from their child as they are worried for their child may develop kidney disease in the future, just like them. What do you tell these worried parents?
Oh, Linda, that's a great question because we encounter that problem all the time. A lot of older parents are worried to accept kidneys from their child or grandchild, and we really understand that because a younger individual have many years ahead of them to live and develop kidney disease. Therefore, there's been a paradigm shift that we have more stringent criteria for accepting kidneys from a young living donors, especially those with a family member on dialysis or requiring kidney transplantation. So we have higher thresholds of renal function thresholds for cutoff and lower blood pressure values at which we accept donors.
Thank you, Dr.
And as I said before, that APOL1 testing may be offered to African American kidney donors too.
There are no more questions at this time.
All right. Well, I'd like to once again thank both Dr. Doshi and Dr. Humar for joining us today to share such an informative presentation on living donation as it pertains to both kidney and liver transplantation. I think, as you can see from the amount of questions we received, I think the audience, our participants, were very engaged and enjoyed the information that you had to share. So thank you so much for that. And additionally, I'd like to extend a sincere thanks to Belinda for also joining us today and taking the time to moderate today's webinar. So thank you all. And to our participants, as always, we thank you for your time, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.